Hidden in the crypts below Tirisfal in the Eastern Kingdoms, those who are loyal to the Dark Lady sleep, below the ruins of the kingdom that was once their home in life. I have to admit I'm pretty excited about this one, even though Forsaken is not really a race I play in World of Warcraft at all. I've kind of tried it once or twice, and I have a confession to make. The vibe, I know it's some people's thing, that kind of dark, gloomy feeling of waking up and exiting the crypts and being in this broken down village, being an undead player, essentially. But that same vibe is the reason why I can't get past the starting area whenever I try to play a Forsaken. I just can't do it. Having said that though, their lore is still pretty interesting and tragic. And arguably, their leader is one of the most recognisable in all of Warcraft. Before I get too deep into it, I highly recommend my human lore videos, which maybe I will link here somewhere, because a lot of what I'm about to talk about is directly related to human history. After all, the Forsaken are undead humans for the most part. So definitely watch that, and hopefully the leftovers of my cold won't make me sound like I have a pinched nose and horrible stuffiness everywhere. I have my tea, I'm not croaking as hard as I was. I think we should get into it. To begin the story of the Forsaken, we should probably start around the time that their Kingdom of Lordaeron suffered a huge defeat. Specifically, the point at which Lordaeron was completely consumed by the Scourge, who were led at that time by Prince Arthas. For a bit more on that, who he is, who the Scourge are, see my human video for sure. But the brief kind of explanation is, the Scourge were risen humans who were compelled by Arthas and the Lich King at that time to serve under them and do their will. They had no free will of their own. Now, the throne of the Lich King and his seat of power, and where you'll find the majority of the Scourge, is up in the continent of Northrend. And there was a plot by the demon hunter Illidan Stormrage to essentially melt the entire continent. There's a lot of snow up there, being northern, and he just wanted to melt all of the snow to get rid of the Lich King's primary power, I suppose. And as he worked on that, the Lich King's power did indeed start to fade a little bit, little by little, as time went along. The Scourge, who were furthest away from where the Lich King was, started to be released from his grip and gain a bit more sentience, remembering who they were and that they had free will. These newly freed Scourge were eventually rounded up by Lady Sylvanas Windrunner. She gathered them all up in Lordaeron and began to stage a coup to kind of bring them all together and gain control over the entire undead army. Now, Sylvanas Windrunner, I've mentioned that name before probably, I've put a few pictures around of what she looks like, but who is she? How did she come to be the leader of all of the Forsaken? She's another character who probably deserves her own video eventually, but the short version is she was a high elf, and she was not just any high elf, she was the Ranger General of Quel'Thalas. As things stand now, she is undead. And I'm not going to go into too much detail right in this video, but I'll give you 3 guesses as to who made her undead. I bet you can guess who. As you can imagine, she hates Arthas, and she wants to destroy him and everything to do with him. So that's where she is at that moment. So anyway, she gathers the forces of the undead, the Scourge, who had changed their minds and become more conscious, and they managed to coerce a lot of the forces around Lordaeron to fight with them. This includes gnolls, bandits, ogres, all kinds of monsters that were roaming the woodlands and the area around Lordaeron. The Dreadlord of Arimathras would fall to Sylvanas eventually, but his life was spared because he offered his loyalty to her, as much as Dreadlords can give their loyalty to anybody at all. And together with the mind-controlled forces of Grand Marshal Garithos, they do eventually free Lordaeron from the control of the remaining Dreadlord, Balnazar. You'll probably remember from my human lore videos, but Garithos did not like anything or anyone who was human. He was pretty closed-minded as far as that goes. But he did agree to join forces with Sylvanas just to free the city and the Kingdom of Lordaeron, which was one of the human kingdoms originally. In return, Sylvanas promised to leave Lordaeron to him, his forces, and the humans once the battle was done. Unfortunately, though, she had absolutely no intention of honouring that pact or that agreement whatsoever. This strange alliance of humans and undead would eventually free Lordaeron, but as soon as the battle was won, everything changed. Sylvanas turned on Garithos and his forces and destroyed all of them. She claims the ruins of Lordaeron for herself and for all of the free-willed undead who were following her. And then she proclaims herself the leader of this faction of free-willed undead that she had gathered to her. And this is the first time we hear them being called the Forsaken as a group. They claim the Undercity of Lordaeron as their own, and complete the network of catacombs and crypts that the Scourge had previously been constructing while they were occupying the ruins of the city. Even today, if you go in-game to the Undercity, you'll see green rivers of this horrible, poisonous, sludgy stuff that runs through the Undercity itself and just fills it with these toxic fumes, and it's disgusting. But of course, the undead and the Forsaken, they don't care. They can't smell anything, and they can't really fall sick in that way. So while most living beings can't really stand being there for long, it was a refuge for the Forsaken, who were hugely misunderstood, being what they were, risen humans who everyone thought were completely mind-numbed, and or servants of Arthas and the Lich King. But still, while they had claimed this base of power, their hold on Lordaeron was pretty tenuous at best. So Sylvanas thought it was about the right time to find allies. So off she sends her emissaries to all across Azeroth, the Eastern Kingdoms, Kalimdor, the continent on the other side, looking for those allies in both the Alliance and the Horde. As far as the Alliance goes, her ambassadors that went that direction never came back. And we still don't really know what happened to them, but her suspicion was that they had been killed. So at this point, the humans of the Alliance, and just the Alliance in general, weren't really aware that undead weren't always allied with the Lich King or with Arthas. They didn't know that some of them had regained their free will and their consciousness and wanted to make a bond with them, to fight together against a greater evil. Also, the whole situation with Garithos can't have gone very well, so once news of that got back to the Alliance, that probably coloured their judgment of the Forsaken somewhat. In any case, I don't think anything good happened to those emissaries. On the other side of the world, though, in Kalimdor, it was the Tauren who welcomed the Forsaken into the Horde. Kind-hearted, shamanistic, believing in the good in everybody. I love the Tauren. The Archdruid Hamul Runetotem saw the potential in them, and knew that no humans would ever give them shelter or aid. So in the end, the decision was kind of made for Sylvanas on that basis alone. She would turn to the Horde as her allies from that point, all the way up until the present day. How did the Forsaken convince the Horde that they were worthy of acceptance? They were claiming to be seeking a cure for this condition that they had, the condition of being undead, I suppose, which they put forward that only shamanism could cure. And in the Horde, you have a ton of races that can be shamans, so Tauren for one, trolls also. Could orcs be shamans at that time? I genuinely can't remember, but for purposes of this, let's say yes. But in exchange for this shamanistic help, they promised to support the Horde in all of its ventures from that point on. Now, the Orc war chief Thrall had experience with battling against the undead on quite a few occasions, and he and the Tauren chieftain Cairn Bloodhoof were immediately suspicious of their motives. Tensions were rising at a really high rate, and so these chieftains deferred their decision to a council of sages known as the Earthen Ring. The Earthen Ring argued that it was the Horde's duty to assist the Forsaken, as they were wrestling with their inner demons just as the Orcs had for generations, which is a fair point, if you ask me. With all of this agreed, the pact was made. The Forsaken now had forces with them to fight against the Lich King, and the Horde themselves had their numbers bolstered in the Eastern Kingdoms. Up until this point, Kalimdor was Horde territory. You had Orgrimmar and you had Thunderbluff over on that continent, and not much of anything on the Eastern Kingdoms. But now they had the Forsaken in Lordaeron. Thrall and Cairn would remain suspicious though, as would the Darkspear trolls, purely because of the way their culture views death and undeath and how it's respected. They have their own cultural shamanistic beliefs, but trust has kind of built up between them over time anyway. And this is where the World of Warcraft timeline begins. So all of this has just happened before the MMO has even started. So, as I mentioned, the Forsaken are the Horde's only foothold in the Eastern Kingdoms, and they use that fact to their advantage. They were tasked with dealing with any enemies that might come close, and whenever any new dead were made, they were instantly sent over to Sylvanas for indoctrination into the Forsaken, and of course they kept their free will. Outside of the Undercity and Lordaeron, Tirisfal Glades was their main home area. For years it's just been covered over with blight, but of course, being undead, as I mentioned before, they don't really care about it very much. It's also home to remnants of the Scarlet Crusade, who you'll remember from my human lore video. They are basically bent on removing all undead from the face of Azeroth, so you can imagine how well that went with them being neighbours. The Argent Dawn, who were like a more compassionate splinter of the Scarlet Crusade, actually chose to help the Forsaken. They're more welcoming to all races of Azeroth. But throughout all of this, they were just constantly battling against humans and dwarves, whose capital cities were rooted in the Eastern Kingdoms. You had Stormwind further down south, and Ironforge kind of further up north a little bit. There were a ton of conflicts between them, like battles for resources in Arathi, Hillsbrad, Alterac Mountains, and the Plaguelands as well. In between all of this fighting though, the Forsaken were beginning research on something new, a very specific plague that actually could be used against the Scourge, so their undead counterparts who did not have free will and who served the Lich King. The Royal Apothecary Society were tasked with this, and were doing all of their research in secret. If you've been in a game for any amount of time, you'll probably know who Nathanos Blightcaller is, but he's basically the champion of the Forsaken, and Sylvanas freed him from the Scourge. He became her right-hand man, and it eventually came to light that they actually knew each other when they were both alive. But eventually, the Blood Elves would go about reclaiming their ancient homeland of Quel'Thalas, and Sylvanas, having once been one of them, of course, offered her help. Quel'Thalas was overrun by Scourge, so of course she had another reason to be in on this fight, but she sent her troops to help the Blood Elves, and was a big kind of supporter for them to be accepted into the Horde as well. Together, her troops and the Elves reclaimed much of the Ghostlands together, including the town of Tranquillion. Meanwhile, this plague research that I mentioned continued on in secret, until the new Lich King, Arthas Menethil, reared his head. Now, as you would expect, the Forsaken were one of the major forces that fought against the Lich King during the Wrath of the Lich King expansion, and Sylvanas herself would move back and forth to Northrend, overseeing the construction of a Forsaken town there. The Apothecary would also take up some residence there to finish their work on the Plague, with plans to unleash it against the Lich King and all his minions by the time the war was over. Meanwhile, Arthas kind of had his own plague that he was spreading, but Grand Apothecary Putris managed to develop a counter-agent, and this put him in some pretty high favour with Sylvanas. In any case, their efforts would come to a head when the plague was finally perfected. During the battle for the Wrathgate, Putris and a band of renegade Plaguebringers appeared. Putris was wondering whether the Lich King thought that the Forsaken had forgiven him, or forgotten what he had done to them. Of course, they hadn't forgotten at all. It was something that would be with them forever. They could not go back to their previous human forms, their previous human lives. They were stuck being undead for the rest of eternity. And so, with that anger, Putrus unleashed the plague. The problem is, he didn't unleash it just on the Lich King and the Scourge. He unleashed it on the Alliance and on the Horde as well. This caused huge losses. It even brought the Lich King to his knees. So, as you can probably tell, things were starting to backfire. Putrus's actions were completely against the orders given to the Forsaken. And even better, while they were away in Northrend, the Dreadlord Varimathras, who you will remember was freed by Sylvanas and was allowed to keep his life, he had taken over Lordaeron all over again. Sylvanas and those loyal to her did manage to escape, and they were taken in by Thrall, the war chief, in Orgrimmar, the capital of the Horde. There they discovered that Putrus had betrayed them, allying with Varimathras to depose Sylvanas. However, the Alliance wouldn't see it that way, because of course they didn't know that Putrus's actions were against what Sylvanas had ordered. They thought the Forsaken were all in it together and were trying to destroy the Alliance at the same time as the Scourge. King Varian especially would hold them responsible for what happened. In any case, the Forsaken would put together a counterattack to try and take back Lordaeron from Varimathras all over again. But Varian caught up with them, and just as he was about to destroy them all, the human mage Jaina Proudmoore teleported all of those human forces away out of the line of fire and battle, which caused the Horde and the Forsaken to reclaim the Undercity. Why did Jaina do that? Because she had been privy to the information. She knew what the deal was, that Putrus had betrayed them, and that Sylvanas wasn't at fault. The repercussions of this followed the Forsaken for a long time, though. Overseers were sent to watch over the city for quite some time, and Thrall's trust in them, which was already not great, got thinner and thinner and thinner. Regardless of that though, Sylvanas still had a personal score to settle. Remember, Arthas is the one who killed her in the first place and brought her back to life, reanimated her to become the Dark Lady. So she personally went back to Northrend with her Dark Rangers to get her revenge on Arthas. They fought their way through the Icecrown Citadel, which was his bastion, I suppose, in Northrend, until they came to the room where she found his blade. The same blade that took her life. Did she fight Arthas? Yes, of course she did. Did she beat him? Not so much, and that really shook her. Sylvanas realised at that point that she could not do this alone, and she needed those allies. With the combined efforts of the Argent Crusade and the Knights of the Ebon Blade, Arthas was eventually defeated. The Ebon Blade being some knights who were under his control, who managed to sort of grapple their way free. And, that was great. Arthas was defeated, his Scourge army was destroyed, but that kind of left a void for Sylvanas and her Forsaken, because that had been their purpose for the longest time, the defeat of the Scourge and of Arthas, who made them what they were. Their sole purpose was to work towards vengeance against him. So what was left for them now? The Forsaken began to turn to other pursuits after this, like the complete conquest of Lordaeron. Sylvanas was truly beginning to understand the rest of Azeroth would see her people as a threat, and so the Forsaken began to fortify the Undercity. Even after the Lich King's defeat, though, some of the Scourge who were more intelligent and had their presence of mind were accepted into the Forsaken, such as the Valkyr. And with them, the Valkyr brought something very new and very exciting that the Forsaken hadn't experienced before, and that was the potential to procreate using their necromantic abilities and bolster the Forsaken ranks even further. Any undead who were risen in this way, so through the Valkyr's necromantic powers, were known as the second generation of Forsaken. These newly risen people of Sylvanas were given a choice when they were brought back to life. They could do whatever they wanted after they were reborn. Either accept their fate, make themselves useful and serve the Forsaken cause, or some of them would react in horror at seeing what they had become. Some would attack villages like Deathnell, which had become populated with other Forsaken, and some of them would just end themselves on the spot. After the cataclysm that destroyed huge parts of Azeroth, the Forsaken launched an offensive against Gilneas, the human kingdom that had been walled off for many long years. They were ordered by their new war chief Grommash Hellscream to do so, and they seemed confident now with their abilities to bolster their forces. And then a bunch of stuff happens in other expansions. Warlords of Draenor, they were helping out there and they had garrisons set up on the planet. And then when the Legion invaded Azeroth for the third time, their dying war chief at that point, Vol'jin the Troll, named Sylvanas the war chief of the Horde. Being the war chief, she would then leave the Undercity, causing the Forsaken to set up the Desolate Council, kind of an interim government to look over the Undercity, while Sylvanas moved herself over to Orgrimmar to rule over all of the Horde. But with this free will that the Forsaken had, some of them were getting restless and were pretty unhappy with the way things were. They were dissatisfied with the Forsaken's kind of strict culture of forgetting their past lives, and they hoped to convince Sylvanas to institute reforms about this. Anduin Wrynn, who had become king after his father's death during the Legion expansion, proposed to reconcile the humans of Stormwind with their Forsaken relatives, and Sylvanas, surprisingly enough, did give permission for this. It didn't end well though. Kalia Menethil, who is the sister of Arthas, tried to encourage the Forsaken to defect over to the Alliance, which was not part of the agreement between the two sides. So for breaking that agreement and going against everything they had decided and listening to Kalia, Sylvanas killed all of them, Kalia included, and the Forsaken that were taking part in this little reconciliation exchange. This just alienated the Forsaken even more from what they once were. Their human lives, any relatives they had left just didn't want to see them anymore. Then the two sides kind of fought over the mineral azurite for a little while, which culminated in Sylvanas deciding to burn the Night Elf world tree Teldrassil, mostly as a tactic to kill the Alliance's spirit. The Alliance would try to reclaim Lordaeron Keep as retaliation, but Sylvanas had it rigged to be completely blighted. Here we are again with the blight. They love throwing plague around. But the entire surface of Lordaeron was completely uninhabitable, and it began to seep into the Undercity as well. With that blight unleashed, the Forsaken were then forced to uproot, get out of Undercity and Lordaeron altogether, and flee to Orgrimmar as refugees. So the Forsaken continue to stand behind the Dark Lady, their Banshee Queen, even though she's used a lot of very strange, underhanded tactics, and has been very manipulative to keep them exactly where they are and doing her will. Any Forsaken who had been lost with all of this fighting and with the burning of Teldrassil were then replaced with dead Night Elves who had been risen as Dark Rangers. And Sylvanas' tactics, especially for the last little while, have just been getting more and more underhanded and more strange. She raised Derek Proudmoore, who is the father of Jaina Proudmoore, the mage who I mentioned earlier, and used him without his free will to attack the Alliance. This sours a lot of the Forsaken against her, because it's literally going against everything that they stand for. They have their free will, that's what sets them apart from all other undead and makes them not completely brainless, mindless monsters. It distinguished them from the Scourge, and now that she had done this, it felt like they were no better. Anyway, eventually Sylvanas betrays her people, denouncing them and the Horde as being nothing, and she abandons them completely. They have no leader for a while until Lillian Voss steps up, and she serves as their representative for a newly formed Horde Council, which I think has one representative from each Horde race. Her main focus was clearing the plague from Lordaeron so everyone could go back and reclaim their city, their refuge that they had fought so hard to claim. But the Desolate Council would be reformed to lead the Forsaken, while Sylvanas goes off to do stuff in Shadowlands. I'm totally ignoring everything that happens in Shadowlands for various reasons. But this time around, the Desolate Council is made up of Lillian, Kalia Menethil, Deathstalker Commander Belmont, Dark Ranger Velinara, and Master Apothecary Farnell. and that's just about where the Forsaken are currently. So they've been through a lot. They've just been destroyed from the Kingdom of Lordaeron, re-raised against their will, freed from the grasp of the Lich King, and had their free will brought back to them, and had Lordaeron blighted a bunch of times by the undead leader who promised to lead them to victory. She now thinks they're nothing and wants nothing to do with them. I have a lot of thoughts about the way Sylvanas' character has developed over the years. She has been quite an interesting Horde leader slash villain towards the Alliance, but her actions lately, especially abandoning the Forsaken altogether, has been very strange, and I know she's on something of a redemption arc now, but we'll see how that goes. I honestly wonder where they're going with that. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this brief rush through the Forsaken lore and where they started from, their origins with the Lich King, to the present day, without a leader, without Sylvanas Windrunner, but still going strong, despite, I think, only just having the Undercity back under their control. Hopefully they have more good stuff coming for them, because they've been through a lot, and a lot of them want their humanity back, but, you know, it's not possible. The Alliance have rejected them, thinking that their undead state makes them untrustworthy, and they have nowhere else to turn apart from themselves and the people who are loyal to them in the Horde. They're tenacious, if nothing else. But let me know what you think. Do you play the Forsaken? And what do you think about Sylvanas and her whole arc that she's going through? She's kind of disappeared for a little bit, but let me know what you think. Do you still enjoy her as a character? Are you not so much of a fan? I'd be very interested to hear in the comments down below. Please don't hesitate to leave a like if you enjoyed this, and subscribe if you haven't already. You know, as always, it means the world to me. I can hear that I'm croaking and that my nose is a little bit stuffy, so I'm going to end this here. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you all, and I will see you in the next video.